Thank you very much, Gaetano, and thanks for putting up this wonderful conference. What a great start. Thank you to all speakers so far, and to the ones that will be speaking after this excellent session, which is starting now. Indeed, we've seen that artificial intelligence started off as a tool to enhance performance, but today it enhances and impacts on content as well. And as such, it also impacts on various values, attitudes, and practices, all the elements that build up one of the definitions of culture. And this session is going to be about artificial intelligence, culture, and society. And without much ado, I would like to get into the topics. We have 3 different speakers, which will get into 3 different perspectives. First, we have Professor Jon Festinger, who is neither British nor Columbia, but he comes from British Columbia. And he is going to talk about what artificial intelligence does in terms of changing media and entertainment, and how things become very personalized, and is it good or bad? What do you think, Jon?
Both.
Right. Okay, there you go.
It's a risk. Right. So first thing is I start my timer. Second thing is I say to Gaetano, that is a fantastic idea. I'll start giving out water bottles for evaluations at the end of my courses. That should work. So that's a great academic trick. Thirdly, in all seriousness, to thank my various students. In past years, I have done entire lectures for one class, my communications law class at UBC. This year, I have run elements of this past all my courses and over a much longer period of time. This is the revised abstract. Ignore it until you look at the papers. This is where things started, and they started with Gaetano. We were speaking over the summer, and he and I simultaneously started talking about what we were thinking about. And these were kind of my notes that I had put on my iPhone notes some weeks before about media of the future being individually tailored in all aspects, because that's the trend that we are clearly seeing, especially in social media. Gaetano saw that, and I saw that. We saw that separately, and of course, in true academic fashion, we decided we would write a paper together. And this is the truth about academia. Oh, look, a cool new research idea. Oh my God, please finish the papers you've already started. But we're here, and more on that later. So where do we begin this exploration of completely individuated AI encouraged, big data encouraged media? And everything I'm going to say, you'll see it's easier to understand in a film context, but absolutely applies in a narrative sense equally to what video games can look like. But this is where I suggest you start thinking about it. Gamer discovers his deceased father's ghost on an old Xbox game, challenges it to a race. Father passes away. Hope you don't relate too much to that. I do. Father was a gamer on the original Xbox, played racing games, which is what I play, and the son found the father's ghost car and the father's time on the Xbox. And so what did the son do? He would race the father, but if he was beating his father's ghost car, what a wonderfully literal name for it, he would stop before the finish line, let his father beat him, because, of course, if he beat his father, the ghost car would disappear. So that's very individual, that's very particular. Also, I am a race sim person. This is a story that I remember very vividly in real time. Grand Prix Legends, it's a game that came out in 1997, had a very avid community that basically rebuilt the game from scratch. And it was an extraordinary game with an extraordinary modding community. And one day somebody wandered onto the forums and said, I've heard about you guys. My father is ill. It was quite clear that what she meant to say was my father was dying, but didn't want to say that. He raced one race in the 1965 Tasman series in Australia. Would it be possible for somebody to make that car set? And those of us who are part of the community, and I'm sorry if I get choked up, immediately somebody came on and said, let's take this offline. And those of us who are part of the community knew that that car set was going to be built. And recently I kind of looked through and I found a car set. It might be that car set by that modder or not. But the point is that was individuated media, and it's deeply connected and deeply emotional. So that's a place to start. Now let me talk a little bit about where this came from. I didn't realize until I went through the exercise that today's talk is part of a trilogy that I gave here. I thought certainly my first talk and my second talk were different, and originally I thought this was a third and different talk. I knew I wasn't doing sequels. Sequels are bad, as most of you know from watching films. But I didn't discover until I was doing it that this was a trilogy. In 2016, I talked about the right to create for mods. I grounded it in post-structuralism, in the notion that modders contribute so much to the game, and sometimes very many more man-hours than the original developers, that there should be a right to mod. Last year, I dealt with a very narrow point, and that was what happens in a fully emergent or emerged virtual reality world if somebody wants to use your information, your data, against you, and you can't tell what's real and what's not real. And in that context, I dealt with when the law should intervene, particularly if you lose your human agency, and what the remedies were, including the possibility of a court enforcing a constructive trust in those circumstances. This year, I'm talking about completely individuated media. And what I realized is that what I'm really talking about is what I didn't talk about last year, and that was whether copyright plays a role. If it's completely individuated, who's supplying the story? And I'm not just being post-structuralist here. You're supplying the elements of the media that's being reflected back to you. Don't you deserve something for that? That's the premise. It's like a card game. It takes two players, the rules of the game, and the cards to play it. It's not any one element. If you just have the cards, there's no game. If there's only one player, it's solitaire. This gets fairly complex fairly quickly. So the common denominator between my talks is, in the end, that it is we who are co-authors effectively, and perhaps are entitled to rights. If we are co-authors in the narrative that we're either playing or watching, don't we get something for that? So that's a skip to the end. But I will remind you of the magnificent work of Bruce Boyden of Marquette, who wrote a paper called Games and Other Uncopyrightable Systems, where he asked himself why, under law, games, not video games, games are uncopyrightable. And came down to two choices: the idea-expression dichotomy, that a game is an idea and that is unexpressed and therefore uncopyrightable, or that a game is a system. And Boyden concluded, by looking at all the jurisprudence, that the correct answer was that games are a system, and the game itself is actually supplied by the players. Systems are shells into which users pour meaning. So yes, that is very consistent with a post-structural view of the world, where you replace, you decentralize the author and replace the author with the reader. So the reader's view of the world and the author's view of the world, in a post-structuralist sense, are equal. Now, whether you believe that or not, it's not hard to accept that both have value. And that's the essence of where we're going today. So, Entertainment 4.0. In QMUL, my colleague from the Center for Digital Media in Vancouver, who's still on the letterhead, in her, on the website rather, in her parlance, most of what I'm going to talk about is narrow AI that already exists. So the starting point here is, what does the technology allow us to do now? And I'm going to put this in a film sense because it's easy. So you might remember that in Star Wars, in the most recent 2 Star Wars films, ultra-realistic digital versions of characters were created and placed into the film because the actors were too old or not around, which led, in fact, to Disney saying, after Carrie Fisher had passed away, that they were not going to bring back a digital Princess Leia for the next film out of respect for Carrie Fisher. Very interesting to note that they didn't say they weren't going to do it because they didn't have the rights. I suspect they actually did have the rights because they'd already done a version of that. So they were not going to do it out of respect. But that tells you how realistic this technology is. And you might remember the fake Obama with the fake Obama voice, and very hard to tell from something that is completely real. And more recently, Epic Games has shown off its technology, which is incredibly impressive. So we keep on making progress in this regard. We have AI that writes screenplays. Watch this film. It's actually not that bad. And think about how far it can go in the future. We have AI that can create soundtracks and insert it into film. We have, can I get some water, please? We have AI that is starting to be able to direct. Thank you very much. But this is the one area, directing, where it might be the general AI is needed. It's somewhere, but it's not probably as far as it needs to be convincing. But I'm pretty sure it's going to get there. But this is the only general AI that seems to be needed. So now let's talk about the other piece. We talked about the technology that allows complete fidelity. So, and you'll see where this goes. Let's talk about what happens when we add that to algorithmically processed big data, specifically about you as an individual. So this notion of algorithms, if you've seen the film War Games, sort of, to me, started here. It was a movie of my youth. And we know that simple algorithms can make mistakes, and that's where we learned it. But this is probably more telling. Some of you may know this. Netflix, when it decided to make House of Cards, took the data, and House of Cards was quite a while ago, took the data supplied by its audience, you, and figured out what its audience liked. And instead of the traditional way of making a film or a TV series, which is you get pitched by a bunch of companies, I used to be in the TV business, a bunch of production companies, and you pick what you think is the best idea, Netflix went out with a 2-pager saying these are the elements based on the data we have on our audience. These are the elements we want in the series. Our subscribers like political dramas. They love Kevin Spacey. We want that in what you're going to do. Give us the treatment. And in fact, it worked. House of Cards worked. Now, maybe people needed to do more deep diving with their AI into Kevin Spacey's other predilections, because he's been fired for reasons you understand. This is a very recent report from Cambridge on the dangers of AI. We've talked about them already this morning, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You can go directly to the report, or you can go to this article, which will give you the short form. All of which raises the question that Chris was talking about this morning. Well, how much law should we have? At what point should we intervene? What are the real dangers? And there are, of course, lots of doomsday scenarios out there, so I need not reinforce that. I've given my own examples here, but play this game with me. What if an algorithm knew your favorite type of movie, your favorite stars, your favorite screenwriter, your favorite plot tropes? What kind of plots do you like? I like time travel that teaches life lessons. That's my thing. Your favorite plot points and dialogue that you laugh at. How's it going to know? Because it hears you laugh. What you cry at. Favorite music. Your personality profile. We've seen how that worked for Cambridge Analytica. So that's entirely possible. Your personal history and biographical details. It's all out there somewhere. It can be found. And pretty well everything else about you. It could make a movie that was really compelling to you and individuated to you. And it should work really well. So at the extreme, it would be like an algorithmically directed The Truman Show. You might be, if it was a game, in the game, or in the movie, you might not even be a character, but it would be so closely aligned to what works for you that it could create almost any emotional reaction that it was going for. But if you go back to this slide, you see that we would, in that world, simultaneously be the audience and effectively a co-creator of the work. And this is where we're going now in social media. This is the feedback we now get from Netflix. Hey, watch this movie. Based on what we know about you, you'll like it. Well, who's supplying that data? You are. One day, you might choose the ending to a Netflix show. That's an appetizer. This is by far the most interesting thing I've seen in a long time along these lines, and this is very recent. This is the new project of Will Wright, which he's looking for artists because how you play the game, and Will Wright's games are always interesting from the perspective of you asking yourself whether they're a game or not, is you supply your memories and the game will create your memories. So that is completely, that's the first step along this completely individuated content made directly for you. Because your version of Will Wright's game and my version of Will Wright's game are going to look very different. Maybe the art style will be the same, but that's about it. So that takes us to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Because what seems to have happened in the US election is that particular people were targeted, forming groups. Not that groups were targeted who happened to be individuals, but that individual characteristics were grouped and targeted with fake news meant for them. That's pretty darn individuated. So if you're looking for dystopic examples, this is the best one we've seen. And we've seen the impact of it. And Mark Zuckerberg isn't looking that good these days. In Canada, and I'm sure many other jurisdictions in the world, are opening inquiries into Facebook for exactly this reason. I just had to show this. Doesn't this feel like a long time ago? This was 2013, Bono on the cover of MIT Technology Review, big data will save politics. Not so far. From an academic perspective, this is written by a ton of people, but the academic reaction, most particularly Jonathan Zittrain of Harvard Law School and others, the basic reaction is we need to research this and we need funding for research, which is a fairly standard academic reaction. But we will, and it outlines some of the problems, including free expression, and interestingly doesn't talk a lot about copyright. Sorry about the darkness here, but I want to talk about a deeper problem, an undercurrent to all of this. And let me check my time while I'm doing it, because I think there's something critical that we need to look at. And that is, this is a film. It's a standard short film about the dystopic universe where corporations run the world and there's no government to be found. That's a fairly standard fantasy. We have it in Half-Life. It's the trope of corporations replacing government. But what it really is a cover for is an actual real-life problem. And that real-life problem is that constitutional rights, or fundamental rights, as Chris referred to them earlier, are generally available in our relationship as citizens with government, not in our relationship with companies. Companies are people. So those are people-to-people relationships, and those, as we know, get moderated through end-user license agreement through contract. So you may know the meme, but I think at this stage, we are all looking rather longingly at constitutional rights and protections, and media companies are looking at us and wondering why we care so much. And that's because we're not getting our fundamental rights. So, legal considerations. I'm going to go through these very quickly because we've covered most of them already. Big question, to regulate or not regulate. This is our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, warning Facebook months ago that if they don't get their act together, we're going to regulate them, which is really interesting. I wonder what the RCMP told him and what they learned from other intelligence organizations that knew then what we all know now about Facebook. There are some issues, political issues and legal issues that could slow down this process. Section 230 of the DMCA, First Amendment free speech rights everywhere in the world. Another answer is privacy. This is a great article from Chris Pounder, which I recommend highly, which takes the Facebook Cambridge Analytica model and puts it through a data protection analysis in the coming European regime and says Facebook fails completely. So that's a bit comforting that the EU rules would work. Last year I talked about information, this is Jack Balkin and Jonathan Zittrain, Jack from Yale, Zittrain from Harvard, with a notion of information fiduciaries, which Balkin immediately jumped on Zuckerberg and said, Zuckerberg admitted that Facebook is an information fiduciary by taking responsibility, which will be very useful in the lawsuits against Facebook that are coming up. Last year I talked about constructive trust as a possibility. There's also a mandatory right to be forgotten that you could impose on this kind of data, that companies have to just forget about it once they've used it, or even not having used it. Our personality rights. If you have so much data about me and you're making films and, that involve me, my personality rights are effectively, or could effectively be a property right. But the core copyright problem in AI is this one. This is Google Clips. It's a smart camera with embedded AI. It's not going across the internet. It's not that expensive. And these are Australian lawyers, but they've written a short note saying, well, there's no intellectual property that belongs to anybody because it's the AI who created the copyright. So that illustrates the problem. It's not really the same problem as the monkey selfie problem, I don't think, because we just seem to not be according animals the rights to copyright. There's an attempt to that. But here's why it's different. Google Clips is taking pictures in my home of my animals. I'm at the very least a set designer. I'm at the very least someone who has supplied all of the information. So that takes us to the final place here. And that is, who are we? What are we supplying? If you know Derek Parfit's work from Cambridge, he notes that our identity is not necessarily the identity of a digital duplicate of us. My daughter, my 16-year-old, makes essentially the same point when I asked her about this talk. The person we show ourselves to be on social media is often our best or our most superficial. Therefore, the algorithmic thing won't work because it won't really show us what we want to see. And that may be true the first time. It's probably not true the 100th time. So all of this proves how complex, I suggest, how complex we really are. And we're so complex that effectively we must be co-creators. So if we're co-creators, shouldn't we have rights? And there is a precedent for this. If you want to look at the Statute of Anne, you can look at it as the beginning of economic rights for authors, but you can also look at it as the end of a trajectory that actually got the rights to their work back to the authors. So the metaphor and the analogy is we're supplying all this data. We could amend copyright law so that we are effectively co-authors, and that gives us control of our own data. And I never before, until working on this, saw copyright as part of the larger solution to this deeper problem. So this is what Gaetano and I are working on, and we will explore this in greater detail, and we hope you'll read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was very interesting. I was wondering if I can just ask you to spend 1 more minute or 30 seconds. If you could say a few more words about how do you see the expansion of this scope of co-authorship? It is an existing concept in copyright, but you're suggesting that you give it a new meaning, right?
Well, I'm suggesting new meaning, particularly because, and different jurisdictions have different decisions, but co-authorship has been a fairly narrowly used method in copyright law. In Canada, for example, the courts have decided that for co-authorship to exist, both co-authors have to intend for it to exist. So there's a very famous case involving Sarah McLachlan, who you may have heard of, and somebody who helped co-write her songs, no doubt, in the studio. He intended co-authorship, she didn't, she won. So we have to, I think, increase the scope of co-authorship because we're still coming in copyright from the 1709 world of thinking of copyright in a very linear way when we are in a very digital place.
Thank you very much. We will continue.